Now we're going to represent these relationships in the database. And again, what we're trying to solve here is this notion of database normalization, third normal form. There is so much theory, right? But in this lecture, I'm just going to condense this down to don't replicate string data and use what are called keys. Use integer keys to point at those things. And we're going to use these integers then to point. So we'll assign each row an integer, and then we're going to point from one row to another using those integers. And so we're going to add these special key columns to each of the tables, and help in the database will even give us help managing those. Now, and so we still need to keep track of, who is the creator of the album, which album a track belongs to. We've got to create these relationships, and we have to come up with ways to store those relationships. And so the idea is we're going to have a column in a table, which is the key column, and we're going to call this the ID column. And so this is a row. It might have many bits of data here, but in this case it's just the name of an artist. So this album is going to belong to an artist. And we're going to assign a number inside the database, and so that Led Zeppelin is 1 and AC/DC is 2. And so we have this key. This is called a primary key. And then later, when we want to say that the Who Made Who album really was done by AC/DC, we put the number 2 in. And so the difference here is, instead of saying AC/DC in this record, we just put the number 2 once we've established this number. So we assign keys, and then we have these pointers that point back. And so that's how we model a relationship with these small integer numbers. And so there are 3 basic kind of keys that we use. One is the primary key, and that is that little ID column that is just a number. But once we give Led Zeppelin the number 1, Led Zeppelin is has got the key 1 for the rest of that database. The logical key is the text area that we use that you might look up. So the title of the band or the title of the album, that's the logical key. And then the foreign key is one of these keys that is really pointing to the primary key of another row. So that's called a foreign key. And you might think that you want to use something like an email address as the primary key for a user table or something like that. The logical key should always be separate, and there should always be a primary key, that integer number. Because things like logical keys do change. People do get new email addresses, and if you've got that email address as a foreign key pointing all over the place, it doesn't work out so well. And so that's why you use these small integer numbers that have no meaning outside. So sometimes if you're on a system and you see a URL and you see some number like 422,016, you're like, oh, that turns out to probably be my primary key in their database. So sometimes you can look in a URL and you can see these primary keys in the URL, but they don't mean anything outside of that particular system. So like I said, a foreign key is a key that is really pointing at a row in a different table. And so we have the album has a primary key for it, but the artist underscore ID points to a row in the artist table, as we will soon see. I have a naming convention, and in my naming convention on this lecture I use ID for the primary key, and then artist underscore ID I use uppercase for the table names, and then artist underscore ID says this is a key, this is just a key that points to the ID key of the artist table. And so that's what I do. So you'll see in all my stuff I'll use that. It's a convention. It's not something SQL forces you to do, but you will find when you go to organizations and work on their databases, these conventions are very important, so I can do something and you can understand the rules in which I created it. Some of these, you'll find this used by some people, you'll find completely different conventions, and that'll be okay. Whatever convention your organization uses, learn that convention. So now we're going to talk about how we put these keys in, and then how we actually make the connections from one row to another row.